Okay, great. Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. We're super excited to have you here at our virtual lecture series. My name is Eileen Corcoran. I am the Director of Service and Outreach at the Vermont Historical Society. I am filling in today for Amanda Gustin, who's a little under the weather, so she's kind of lurking in the background a little bit, and happy to answer some questions and hopefully chat with us as we go along. So I will do my best to manage this as well as she usually does, but definitely hang tight with us if we have any tech issues or anything like that. But speaking of Amanda, so this is the next to the last lecture series program we have for 2023. So you can definitely see Amanda and get a chance to talk with her next month on April 19th for her talk on James Wilson and the New American Globe. So we hope you will join us one last time for that. But today we are excited to have Tom Anderson Monteroso here to talk with us on Bringing Geography Home, Genieve Lamson and the Human Ecology of Vermont. Tom is preparing his thesis on Genieve Lamson as a student in the graduate program in history at the University of Vermont. He lives in Burlington, and Tom's work is supported by the David J. Haber Robin D. Edelman Vermont History Research Scholar Award, administered by the Center for Research on Vermont at UVM. So welcome, Tom, and we're going to be, I see I have one hand up with Grace. Hang on. Grace, did you have a question? Grace, did you have a question?
Yes,
Yeah.
Her name is Genieve, not Genevieve.
Thank you. I'm sure Tom would have told me that.
Oh, no.
Thank you. I'm sure
Stolen Tom's
people
thunder.
know her better than I do.
Wonderful. So Tom, tell me what I've gotten wrong already and give us all the great information.
Thank you, Eileen. Thanks to Amanda for inviting me to give this talk, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this snowy day. Today, I'm going to talk about Genieve Lamson, a geographer born in 1887 and raised in Randolph, Vermont, where her family ran a furniture store. There are many stories one could tell about Lamson. She pursued her love of travel from a young age and developed a love of hiking, as seen here. She organized for women's suffrage and in politics. To quote her academic colleagues, she rebelled against the republicanism of her forefathers, against the republicanism of her immediate family, of her relations to the farthest remove, and of her friends. Professionally, she trained with some of the most prominent geographers of her day, and a giant of women's education at Chicago, and taught at Vassar College for 30 years. She was a spirited educator who helped create films, museum exhibits, and a local guidebook to teach lessons in economic and cultural geography. She maintained a rich correspondence with her sisters and friends throughout her life, and she made clothes and sang and danced. She was a doting aunt and mentor. Her story crosses paths with that of this society multiple times. First in 1923, when Lamson became the first woman to address a VHS annual meeting, giving a talk titled "A Geographical Interpretation of the Political Convictions of Early Vermonters" at the State House. A recap in the Montpelier Evening Argus noted that, quote, "She stressed the need of more geographical knowledge in order that one may study intelligently and understand the conditions of people all over the earth." This address was an outgrowth of her University of Chicago master's thesis titled "Geographic Influences in the Early History of Vermont," which the Society later reprinted in its proceedings. While at Chicago, she learned from both Ellen Semple, a leading voice of environmental determinism, and Zonia Baber, a determined anti-racist and cosmopolitan. Lamson's thesis made use of details drawn from various town histories published in the preceding 60 years to synthesize what is essentially an environmental history of Vermont settlement. Notably, she plainly discussed both a time of, quote, Indian occupation before the white man invaded their country, and early French settlements and what became Vermont. Incredibly, to me, she wrote the whole thing in 1 week. And later in retirement in the 1950s and 60s, Lamson served as a VHS trustee. Today, I'll focus on a project she did for the Vermont Commission on Country Life, a group primarily known for its eugenics agenda. Eugenics, for those who don't know, is the idea that society can and should be improved through directed breeding. It sprang from the mind of Englishman Francis Galton, who was a man of leisure, a geographer, note the globe, Amanda, and a cousin of Charles Darwin. Eugenics discounts the role of the social environment in favor of hereditarian explanations for social problems, and in practice is white supremacist, sexist, ableist, and immoral. Numerous American geographers subscribe to this approach, despite their own field's inclination to view the natural environment as determining human behavior. Ellsworth Huntington of Yale, shown here at lower right, who was perhaps the best known of these, advised the Vermont eugenicists. Lamson has not been discussed very much in the literature on the Commission on Country Life, the work of Kevin Dan and Nancy Gallagher being the most thorough examples. Dan included one attention-grabbing note in his 1991 article, From Degeneration to Regeneration for Vermont History. Lamson, quote, accused Perkins and Taylor of stealing her work. Perkins was Henry F. Perkins, professor of zoology at the University of Vermont. He's here on the left, and the driving force behind the eugenics survey of Vermont, begun in the mid-1920s. In the mold of earlier projects elsewhere, the survey sought to trace the effects of antisocial degenerate genes in the Vermont population. Taylor was, on the right here, Henry C. Taylor, the nationally known agricultural economist whom Perkins recruited to run the Rockefeller-funded expansion of the eugenics survey into the Vermont Commission on Country Life later in the 1920s. This was billed as a comprehensive survey and had the active cooperation of leaders in state government and at UVM. I want to uncover the story behind Lamson's accusation today, or part of it at least. Lamson's voluminous papers are at Silver Special Collections at UVM, but there's a curious gap in the archival record for these years around 1930, which I suspect was intentional on her part, though I have no evidence of that. For the story, we have to visit the state archives in Middlesex, where the commission's records have landed. Local newspapers and the newsletter of the commission are likewise invaluable. By 1928, Lamson had been teaching at Vassar College for 6 years or so. I want to give you a taste of her intellectual preferences and influences during that time before coming back to Vermont here. In 1925, she'd begun a doctoral program at Columbia University, nominally under prominent economic geographer J. Russell Smith, who was off traveling the world for a year, and who, even when he wasn't traveling, preferred writing textbooks to teaching. Vermont historian Nancy Price-Graff describes Smith's book on North America, seen here, published the same year Lamson started at Columbia, as, quote, a distressing mix of eugenics, racism, prejudices, and social Darwinism. If you're like me, you first encountered Smith as a grandfather of the permaculture movement, which is a whole different story. Lamson didn't stick around to learn Smith's methods. The commute from Poughkeepsie to Manhattan and the impact on her teaching schedule probably were not the only reasons why. In August of 1926, she joined a field course in the Connecticut River Valley by Derwent Whittlesey, then a faculty member at the University of Chicago and soon to move to Harvard. Trained in history as well as geography, Whittlesey was more empirical than Smith in his methods and more open-minded. His expedition grew out of his involvement with a cohort of geographers who were pushing each other to develop new field survey methods during annual outings in the Midwest. Whittlesey was also heavily influenced by French geographers, French approaches to human geography, which treated the region as an almost organismal entity while simultaneously eschewing generalizations about causation of human behavior. Soon after, Lamson wrote a rapt review of a major French work in translation. The translation was done by Millicent Todd Bingham, a Vassar graduate, who was the first American woman to earn a PhD in geography from Harvard, and she is shown here. Right. November 1927 brought a great flood to Vermont, which devastated Randolph and the rest of the state, leaving 84 dead, 9,000 homeless, and $100 million in damage. The ruins in Randolph are seen here on the left. While Lamson called upon the federal government to fund the recovery, Perkins and his collaborators responded by turning to an alliance among Rockefeller philanthropy, elite social scientists, and Vermont progressive social reformers to advance a comprehensive transformative survey of rural Vermont that would right social ills and remake the state to the liking of a progressive educated minority. Geographers provided inspiration, collegial advice, technical assistance, and access to power for what became the Vermont Commission on Country Life. It launched in the summer of 1928 with funding for 3 years. Perkins' eugenics survey became the Committee on the Human Factor, the only committee with a significant operating budget. Lamson's father died that September. Her mother had died 10 years earlier. Her parents gone, then 41 years old. Lamson set herself to doing meaningful work, Vermont work, to complete her PhD and thereby secure a promotion at Vassar. By December, she was at a geography conference in New York, chasing down leads on various land use studies underway in her home state. This led to Taylor, who asked her to interview with Dorothy Canfield Fisher, seen here on the right, who was then living in Poughkeepsie. Fisher was a Vermont celebrity, if such a thing existed. She was internationally known for her novels, essays, and humanitarian work in Europe during the Great War. Fisher was also a literary gatekeeper at the Book of the Month Club, but in this case, she was called upon to vet a geographer. Lamson and Fisher met in April 1929, and Fisher was charmed. She wrote to Taylor, quote, "My impression is that Miss Lamson would not only be a good investigator and sound research worker, but would be a real help to you with initiating suggestions that come from a much richer fund of information than most of the Vermonters you will be working with. And at the same time, with the bone-deep feeling about Vermont possibilities, which will keep a Vermonter born and bred from being too utopian about such possibilities." Taking a leave of absence from Vassar, Lamson joined the commission as a field investigator, and with the understanding that her work would lead to a PhD from UVM. Part of the funding came from the granite industry, whose managers were curious to know more about their diverse labor force and how workers were increasingly setting up as part-time farmers. The captains of other industries declined to participate. This was, notably still before the economic crash of that fall. A portion came from the Federal Bureau of Agricultural Economics, which hoped to catalyze the creation of a Department of Rural Sociology at UVM. As for the work, Perkins had long desired a closer look at the behavior and effect of the state's rural French Canadian population. Under the Subcommittee on Population Changes, this widened to a study of foreign-born farmers and their families more generally. Lamson visited every farm in 7 towns. This is the map of the 7 towns from her report and the first title page of her report. First was Randolph, her hometown. Her family home is in the upper left. These are the maps she made for each town as well. And not a photo from her collection, but representative of the town at the time. Brookfield, neighboring Randolph, where she once taught school. Richford in the north, and neighboring Berkshire by the Quebec border there. And then we have Reigate, Barrie, where people had their own ideas about the causation of events. And finally, Pulteney to the southwest. A passage from Lamson's study gives the character of her approach. Quote, an attempt was made to create an informal and friendly atmosphere for the visit with each farm family, and wherever possible to include both the farmer and his wife in the discussion. Among people of foreign birth, particularly among recent comers, the children frequently acted as spokesmen, displaying keen observation and interest in the family affairs. The field worker's background of considerable foreign travel proved a great asset in establishing cordial relations with the foreign-born farmers. The eagerness and pleasure with which they spoke of their former homes had an element of pathos and brought a realization of the community responsibility for their adjustment. Less graciously, Lamson also sought private information about farm families from town clerks, bankers, and teachers. Along the way, she reported out in presentations to women's clubs and civic groups, teaching the communities about themselves. Lamson's report featured 16 tables, 2 of which are shown here. Such enumeration was typical of any discipline, whether it be geography or eugenics, staking its claim to being a science. Note how she grouped the towns into 2 basic groups, those with high percentages of foreign-born farmers and those without. In the absence of paid assistance, friends and family occasionally helped Lamson tabulate her data. Now I'm going to hit you with lots of text. Much of her discussion focused on the economic challenges faced by all farmers in Vermont, and this became universal background to the question of the role of the foreign-born. In fact, quote, economic adjustment must be preceded by a psychological adjustment, she said. In a word, this meant neighborliness, or better, inclusion and cooperation. Though Lamson didn't directly condemn eugenics, at least not in what I've seen, she clearly diverged from Perkins' way of thinking about difference and community betterment. In important ways, she anticipated Ellen Anderson's radical study of Burlington that turned the eugenics survey on its head a few years later. In other ways, she shared with Dorothy Canfield Fisher complicity in a terrible project of social engineering. Lamson insisted on the subjective nature of her conclusions. This mode of social science research came into vogue much later with the embrace of feminist theory. We can also think about whether Lamson's attention to women's experiences of space and place make her a feminist geographer, another term of the late 20th century. Lamson's was also very much a Vermont geography, for she leaned on her insider knowledge of the country schools where she had once taught, the group dynamics of a Grange Hall dance, and the ways that hearing multiple language on the sidewalk defined a Saturday in town. Her colleagues at Vassar later said that by describing the Vermont farmer, she described herself. Final report of the Committee on the Human Factor is a bizarre patchwork that includes some of Lamson's observations but its final recommendations are pure Vermont eugenics. This is but one way that Lamson was marginalized while she did this work. UVM slammed the door in her face regarding her doctoral work. They had no suitable department to host her. Lamson's attention then turned to publication to appease the higher-ups at Vassar and advance her career. Among others, Joseph Hills of the UVM Agricultural College denied her this. Her meager pay was slow to reach her. She was kept guessing by a murky chain of command and an even murkier scope of research. She was barred from discussing her work in public. Note how these recommendations differ from what Lamson found in the field. Perkins scolded her for poor note-keeping and for, well, being a geographer. She had accepted work at the disciplinary margins of geography and was punished accordingly. In the end, after telling off Perkins and Taylor in the letter Kevin Dan cited, she self-published her study in the fall of 1931. Like Lamson preparing her archives, I've chosen not to dwell too much on her humiliations or her imperfections here. Back to her good times. Lamson sent 600 copies of her 70-page booklet to all sorts of people. It reached Sinclair Lewis and, through a friend, Robert Frost. She presented her Vermont work to both social scientists and geologists, as opposed to geographers. The geologists and the geographers were very much intermingled at this point, at a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in New Orleans. In the winter following publication of her report. Following additional fieldwork in Poultney, she sang the praises of that town's Polish community at the International Geographical Congress in Warsaw, Poland in 1934, where she served as one of 2 delegates of the Society of Women Geographers and was one of only 25 Americans in attendance. She always planned to update her Vermont Commission on Country Life material, and for the remainder of her career completed fieldwork to that end. She was eventually promoted and regularly hosted Vermont sugaring off parties for Vassar students in the dormitory where she was the head resident. When she retired in 1952, she was replaced by none other than David Lowenthal, best known to this group as George Perkins Marsh's biographer. She had long wanted to write a detailed history of the Lamson farmstead in Randolph, but settled for histories of her church and of her family's summer colony at Highgate Springs. In addition to her service to VHS, she led the Randolph Historical Society and the Vermont division of the American Association of University Women. Genieve Lamson died in 1966 following a stroke. Her story shows that nothing, neither geography nor the Commission on Country Life, nor Vermont itself, nor any person is only one thing. As a society and as individuals, we're still learning that lesson every day. And we have plenty of time for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. So again, feel free if you have questions, you can use the Q&A, you can use the chat, or you can use the raise hand function. Well, while we wait for questions, I'll ask sort of my question I always like to ask is what might be the most surprising or interesting thing that you learned about her that you sort of didn't know before?
Well, I didn't know much at all before. Let's see, I first found her based on her the work she did on advocating women's suffrage, and sort of stumbled on her papers at UVM based on that kind of search. And I had already independently been interested in the history of geography in America in this period, so knew some of the figures she was involved with. I was, sort of amazed how many different people she was in touch with and worked with in different ways. There were far more than I presented here at the American Geographical Society and at University of Chicago and elsewhere. As we heard earlier, I think, there are people certainly who knew her and know more about her as a person than I've learned from looking at old letters.
Great. So first question, can you talk more about the involvement of the granite industry in paying for portions of the survey? Is there any record of their reactions to her final report?
Oh, good question. I haven't seen reactions. I don't know that they may have even seen the results. I don't know quite what the reporting was later. Perkins was happy to sort of disown her results, so he probably wasn't communicating very clearly with the sponsors down the line. There was let me mix up my facts here, but there was someone who was a contact of Perkins, I believe Donald Smith, who was he had studied the labor force in the granite industry, and he was one of a couple of people that Perkins attempted to bring on to this subcommittee on population change to sort of reinterpret her data. And I don't know too much about his allegiances or priorities, but it was interesting that to see all the other industries that turned this opportunity down and said, oh, we'd better, probably best if we don't get involved with that. It was part of what made her job tough. Was there were different funding sources and different claims on her work, and different obstacles to having it published.
Great. So next question is, were you able to find her work in the archives, or I guess her complete works in her archives, or there's still a gap in what you were able to find?
Yeah, I think there's a gap. I mean, honestly, I haven't been in touch with her. Well, she doesn't have direct descendants, but she was close with one of her nephews who was involved in getting her papers set up at UVM. And I don't know, I haven't done that work to see, his children or something, but I imagine I don't know if she must have had a cache of letters, because all her other years of her life she has voluminous correspondence with her sisters and friends, and that must have been going on during these years, and for whatever reason, could have been an accident, could have been by design. That's not in the UVM collection, but what is in Middlesex at the State Archives is the files of the Commission on Country Life, so the correspondence from their end. And there are some allusions to conversations and letters that don't appear in the files. So yeah, there's more. I'm sure she expressed strong opinions to her, circle throughout this process. There was a little scrap of a poem she wrote in gratitude to her friend Hallie Flanagan, who was a important theater director who was also a teacher at Vassar, and just that she provided some support throughout this and was there for her when other people weren't.
Great. So next question, couldn't help but notice the lack of deep South Vermont towns in Lamson's study. Do you think she missed any perspectives that way?
Sure, yeah, I think the town selection was an issue, not just for her study, but overall with the Commission on Country Life, and they tried to send maps out to committee members and have them specify where they thought would be good places to look, and they made some effort to not have different investigations happening in the same town. But whether, I mean, there's this idea, the typical Vermonter, and then also, the typical Vermont town. And Genieve Lamson was, she chose her own hometown, which is significant. It was convenient, she knew it well, which certainly has, valid reasons for choosing for research, but she didn't really make that clear as someone might today, placing their work in relation to their own biography. And she was looking for towns with different populations of, what were called the foreign born. So yeah, Richford near the border, and then different kind of quarrying towns had different populations of people of different origins. Yeah, in southern Vermont, I mean, some of the industry towns see some of the same patterns of immigration. See farther south in New England, and it's possible that the fact that the certain industries didn't want to support this work dissuaded investigations of those areas. So yeah, she tried to do different things, but yeah, can't do it all. There was also this just general question about what the role of part-time farming. There was a group in Massachusetts doing this earlier, and just what was going on with these part-time farmers who are also working in industry. And she looked into that heavily around Barrie. And I think she was very impressed with just the way that the economy had taken on its own special form, given the people and the different opportunities available. And I think she determined that it was very self-sufficient, as opposed to some places that were more, sort of a monocultural economic situation.
Were there other researchers in the field at the same time and in the same places as Genieve? Was her voice being drowned out by competing interpretations, or were the misinterpretations, quote unquote, simply imposed from above?
Yeah, there was a lot of work. There was some land use studies, which is out of UVM at the time. And I can't say exactly what towns people were working in. I think that's sort of one strand that was she was trying to track down and led to this. And there are people who didn't directly engage with the Commission on Country Life who were doing similar work. Shortly after, there was a paper in the journal Economic Geography by economics professor at UVM, and about the agricultural economy of Vermont, which, doesn't engage in any of this discussion of ethnicity and culture. So yeah, there were different groups. There was a whole group meeting in Boston that was focused on New England agricultural marketing, and that sort of brought in a lot of geographers, and was a place of discussion. So people were modeling studies on what other state agricultural schools were doing. Yeah, I read a paper recently that was sort of looking at the role of agrarianism as a ideology that was present in the work of a lot of prominent American geographers at this time. So just sort of this idea that agriculture is the norm and the highest form of life, really, or way of living, and everything else is a aberration. So that sort of thinking was going on in geography, just trying to, like everything else in society, coping with rapid change, following big industry and transportation and lots of different changes.
The question was asked, was this study the only one she worked on for the commission and eugenics survey?
Yeah, it was. And yeah, she was trying to make it, she wanted it to be her own. She was claiming independence as a researcher throughout this time, or as she hit roadblocks, increasingly clearly stating that she was the one who was going to use this work and interpret it and write what she wanted to write. But she did later, after the funding dried up, the Commission on Country Life became a membership organization for the rest of its time, and she was a dues paying member. And her motivations for that, I can't say exactly, but I'm sure in part it was important to maintain the connection, to have access to things she had worked on. But again, what she felt about the overall project and mission is a little obscure to me.
Yeah. Question, can you talk a little bit more about her involvement in the suffrage movement?
Sure. I don't know how many specific things I can recall, but she organized a big event in Randolph that featured some prominent speakers, and then she also traveled to, after the amendment was ratified, she traveled to the last meeting of the National Suffrage Group, and she wrote back for a local paper, basically as a reporter, and she was sort of wanted to shame the Vermont government. I'm trying to, I'm not that familiar with this history, but the governor had vetoed the ratification of the suffrage amendment, and Genieve Lamson was trying to show that this was a shameful thing, and she was part of this national movement, and I think that just that being involved in that was part of what formed her political self going forward. Along with other things, I alluded to she had a mentor, Marion Talbot at Chicago, who is an important figure in women's higher education nationally, and in home economics, who just sort of felt like basically any roadblock, any obstacle to women's equality in the classroom and in academic conversations should be, removed. So it was another strong force in her life, and they visited each other and continued to write letters. And Genieve sent a copy of her study to Talbot when Talbot was later running a school in Turkey.
Were any of her papers journals or diaries? And also, did she comment later on the 1931 sterilization law and later eugenics developments at all?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at all of her papers because I haven't had time. There are a lot of them. The diaries at UVM are recently transcribed by staff and students, and her handwriting is actually remarkably easy to read, but there's only a few years earlier in her life, kind of like around 1910, I believe, and then there's a lot more to look through as far as direct responses to the eugenics cause. So there's more to learn.
Yeah. So question answers, I usually think of eugenics in Vermont as relating to the Native American Abenaki population. Did she address that aspect of it?
So I mentioned what her statement from her thesis, which was talking more about the period of first European American settlement in Vermont, and she had this clear idea that the white people were invading the land of indigenous people. She doesn't discuss indigenous people as a group in her study for the Vermont Commission on Country Life, and I don't recall other references that she made. So I can't say. I mean, she was going farm to farm. She certainly had an appreciation for the existence and the rights of that group, generally speaking. So I think she called out specific interesting examples of farmers of different backgrounds. So I think if she encountered a farm with a farmer of an indigenous background, I think she probably would have made mention of that. So yeah, while her study was within the Committee on Human Factor, it was adjacent to the core eugenics work, which was clearly a very awkward position to be in. And she didn't really, I didn't see other comments on that topic.
Great. What challenges did she face as a woman professional in geography? Did she have professional interests outside of Vermont?
Yeah, challenges. I think it's interesting. Women in geography at this time geography was in some ways more open to women than some other fields early in the 20th century. There was sort of a pathway through teaching school, and geography was associated with that as a sort of elementary subject, grade school subject. So a lot of women then did training in normal schools as teachers, and that was one channel. And then they pursued further education in geography. And Genieve Lamson, largely fits that pattern. She taught in small schools in Vermont, and then she taught for a number of years in a high school in New Jersey before starting as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. And she wasn't set on geography initially. I should mention she also attended the Bay Path Institute in Massachusetts to be trained as a teacher of business and related subjects. But she was interested in literature and history, European history, British literature, and yeah, studied many things, but then went into geography. Marion Talbot wanted her to follow in her own footsteps and be a dean of women at a university, but and Lamson didn't. She was done teaching high school. She wanted to get into some media material, so yeah, she was certainly fortunate in the scheme of things to get this position at Vassar. She had some stiff competition for that, but yeah, I mean, while the opportunities were more, they weren't, it was still not too many options. And later in the 20th century, that it closed down more, kind of post World War II, became more heavily masculine field than it had been before. And then I think there was another part of that question maybe that I'm missing, but
I think you got most of it.
Oh, her other interests outside. She had a lot of other interests. Yeah. I mean, she started studying local geography of Poughkeepsie, but she also kept traveling with students from Vassar in Europe for summer courses. And she wrote, well, so she didn't publish a lot, but she gave courses on many parts of the world, and went on many trips and was looking at transportation infrastructure and all kinds of things along the way.
All right, looks like Mary's got her hand up. So Mary, you should be able to unmute yourself. Maybe not. Okay. Well, Mary, if you still have something, a question or something to say, just let us know. Okay.
That actually, the spelling of her name, yeah, was a research challenge too, because you're not the only one.
Everybody call her
was
Genevieve like me.
Okay. Yeah. So Burlington Free Press, I think, was pretty relentless in doing that.
Yeah. So a couple of nice comments in the chat. Again, it looks like we did have a couple of her relatives are due on this.
Oh.
So that's lovely.
Yeah, sorry, I haven't been in touch, but would love to be.
Yeah, and a link from Rachel about the digitized link to the digitized diaries, and comments about her papers at Vassar. And then Mary says she did similar farm studies in New York and Romania. How exciting. All right, Grace looks like she's got her hand up. Grace, you should be able to unmute.
Yes, I just wanted to say I'm a grand niece, as is Mary,
wonderful.
As is Judy, who are listening.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how can we contact you?
Oh yeah, I can my email address is there on the bottom of the screen, or you can get in touch through VHS, I'm sure.
Tanders7 at UVM.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I look forward to talking to you.
Okay, another question. What was the source of the Lamson family's income?
Yeah, I mean, that's an impressive house. And it was built by Guernsey, prominent architect in the Montpelier area. Right, I mean, in the 18th century, Thomas Lamson, again, my audience will know this better, but moved to Randolph. So Geneve's family was, one wing of many by this time, but yeah, running this busy furniture store was the main economic endeavor. And yeah, there's some interesting observations I read from her student days in Chicago. She was, well, just looking around at her peers, and she was kind of not impressed with some of them. They weren't able to fix their clothes, and just not very handy in the ways of, doing your own work and making do. But yeah, and then her one sister married and moved to Washington, D.C., another stayed in Randolph and worked at the store. Her brother had various economic things he was involved in, but I believe he was involved in the store as well. And he died somewhat young, relatively speaking.
Yeah, Grace, I think that was a new hand raise, so I don't know if you had any additional go on that.
Well, Tom pretty much got it, I think. Whitcomb Elisha Lamson was her father, and her mother, Hannah Amelia Philbrick, came from Maine, and they seem to have met in Boston when Whitcomb was working at a furniture store there, and she was teaching there.
Right, and her father spent maybe a year and went west to, I think, Kansas to kind of continue in this
I think
dry goods trade, but then returned.
Yes, I think so. And a brother of his was in Kansas as well.
Okay, yeah, and he bought out his employer, I think, of the business in Randolph.
Could be.
I believe.
And thank you for sharing there. You told me things that I did not know about her. Great. especially about the writing that she did and the research that she did on farms. I knew she had done it, but she never told us anything about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting how she wanted to do a lot more. And even before she started working for the Commission on Country Life, I believe she had this project in mind to write a focus study on the Thomas Lamson farm, using all the farm records, which would have been in it, the Agricultural History Society was sprang up in the 1920s, and it would have been an interesting entry. Yeah.
So I thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone. We're basically just at the end of our talk. So Tom, just one more couple of minutes if you have anything else that you happen to want to mention or came up that you thought of that.
No, I mean, yeah, I'm really happy to hear from
Great.
her family members, and I mean, obviously I'm especially interested to know if there's a little, stack of papers in a box somewhere, but as I said, it's not like I've exhausted everything there is to see at UVM. So yeah, another I guess place to look for people interested in her is her file as a member of the Society of Women Geographers, which is held by the Library of Congress. That's a pretty good one-stop sheet. They put out a publication annually, and she filled out the questionnaire pretty much annually. So that gives a lot of insight into what she was doing, what she wanted to be doing, how she presented herself, through the years.
Wonderful. And we'll look forward to, I'm sure, reading your thesis when you're done.
Great.
And again, thank you for joining us all today. Again, our last virtual talk for 2023 will be April 19th. And have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.